On behalf of our nation, I want to apologize to Brett and the entire Kavanaugh family for the terrible pain and suffering you have been forced to endure. Those who step forward to serve our country deserve a fair and dignified evaluation, not a campaign of political and personal destruction based on lies and deception.
It was a contentious confirmation. Brett Kavanaugh has been sworn in as the latest U.S. Supreme Court justice, despite massive opposition, particularly stemming from multiple allegations of past sexual misconduct. A divided Senate narrowly confirmed him over the weekend after a turbulent hearing. An FBI report concluded there wasn't enough evidence to back up a sex assault claim by Professor Christine Blasey Ford against Kavanaugh. It's being seen as a major victory for Donald Trump, who's effectively stacked the country's highest court in favor of conservatives. But some strategists say the backlash could actually propel Democrats into office in the upcoming midterm elections. Interesting times. Well, to discuss this, we're joined from Washington by John Malcolm, who is the Senior Vice President of the Institute for Constitutional Government, as well as our former Deputy Assistant Attorney General. And also in Washington, D.C., we have Anisha Singh. She's the Senior Organizing Director of the Generation Progress Team at the Center for American Progress. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Anisha, let me begin with you. First of all, do you accept the confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh now? And do you respect the apology from the president to Kavanaugh and his family for this process?
I think it was extremely disrespectful for the president to apologize on behalf of the entire country when we know survivors of sexual assault and sexual violence have come forward bravely and courageously across this country, coming to Washington, D.C., and sometimes speaking for the first time ever about their own trauma, reliving their trauma, and to completely disregard that trauma and say that, you know, what Kavanaugh went through was shameful and unacceptable, and ignoring what Dr. Blasey Ford went through and what survivors have had to go through watching this process. I mean, it's completely disrespectful. And to think that, you know, from day one, this entire process, whether it's the hearing, the first hearing, the second hearing, the FBI investigation, norms and precedent have been violated and pushed aside to push this nominee through to confirmation without allowing a thorough investigation, without allowing a thorough hearing with respectful witnesses and experts of trauma to come forward to make sure that every stone was turned. So this entire process has just been completely frustrating for a lot of us who were watching.
Right. So a lot of stuff to tackle here. John Malcolm, disrespectful, disregarding the trauma of many people, and also another claim by Anisha, the fact that the executive is fiddling with the process, the executive branch is fiddling with this entire process. Does any of that check out in your opinion?
Well, I don't know what that means to say that the executive is fiddling with the process. The president nominated somebody. The Senate had its advice and consent rule. It was messy, to say the least. I think it is just wrong to say that survivors are not listened to. I think that, of course, every survivor should be listened to. That doesn't mean that their word should be taken at face value without any attempt to corroborate that information. In this case, the Senate and the FBI conducted an investigation, and there was no corroborating information to support the claims of Dr. Ford or Debbie Ramirez or Julie Swetnick. It does not mean that people are somehow not believing of survivors or disrespectful of survivors. After all, there have been rape convictions in which survivors, or, you know, somebody said, and I believe that they were raped. This is the person who raped me, and they've been convicted. And DNA evidence has come along and exonerated those people. So occasionally, people do have things happen to them. Nobody is questioning that Dr. Ford was somehow not molested. She was just not correct, or at least not corroborated, as to the attacker. That we still do have due process in this country. We still do have a presumption of innocence. A thorough investigation was done, and Judge Kavanaugh has now become Justice Kavanaugh, I think correctly so.
Anisha, the system is robust. You went through the process, and this is what we have right now. We have a new Supreme Court justice. It was messy, as John said, and we are where we are now after all that messiness. The evidence didn't meet the the scale of the accusations? Go ahead.
The evidence did not meet the scale because all the evidence was not presented. We had 1 week for the FBI to investigate. With a limited scope, certain witnesses were not allowed to be interviewed, and the FBI did not reach out to certain witnesses, including Dr. Blasey Ford herself. We had an individual who was Kavanaugh's roommate who came forward and said that he has lied under oath about his drunken behavior and his lifestyle during college. And I'm here to talk about that. He was not questioned. There's so many individuals that we were hoping would have been questioned to make sure that this was a thorough process, and yet it was jammed through. A week was given, limited scope, and so we don't have all that information. So all of the unanswered questions, especially that is being brought up by John right now, whether or not it was Kavanaugh who Dr. Ford is remembering, all of those questions cannot properly be answered without those witnesses being questioned, without all of the evidence. And so to say that is one thing. And then we also learned so much during his testimony itself, just looking at his temperament, right? Looking at Kavanaugh's temperament throughout the process, the way he was politically attacking the left, the Clintons were brought up. What is his judicial temperament? Can he be
okay, that's an interesting point.
Fair and independent? Okay,
so I think if we can all agree on the fact that we're not going to get any sort of agreement here on whether there was a sexual assault or not, or whether there was a proper process to determine that. Let's move to his temperament. John, would you agree then with Anisha that an interesting subplot spun out of this, that in the way he was defending himself by almost claiming a conspiracy against him, mentioning the Clintons, railing against the left, is that the sort of impartial Supreme Court justice you want at the table, making some of the most fundamental decisions that decide the future of the nation?
Sure. Well, first of all, every person who was supposedly a witness to the events in question was, in fact, interviewed. With respect to Justice Kavanaugh's temperament, we don't need to guess about that. He has been a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals for the last dozen years. The American Bar Association, hardly a bastion of conservative legal thought, interviewed well over 100 of his fellow judges and litigants who have appeared before him many, many times, all of whom said he has an outstanding judicial temperament. Yes, he was hot under the collar when he was responding to Dr. Ford and the other allegations that had been made against him. And my God, the man was accused of spiking drinks and facilitating the gang rape of women. And my strong suspicion is that if he had behaved in a robot-like, calm manner, perhaps befitting of a judge on the bench, that the response would have been, well, surely he must be guilty, because anybody who would be responding to allegations of this nature would be righteously indignant. And the fact that he was calm indicates that surely he must have done the things about which he was accused.
John,
so Brett Kavanaugh was damned if he did, and damned if he didn't.
That's interesting. Given that you bring up a hypothetical, I don't like to ask hypothetical questions, but given that you brought up a hypothetical, if it was the other way around and we had a nominee, somebody in the vetting process, somebody in the spotlight, railing against the Koch brothers and Fox News and conservative media being out to get him, would you trust that judge and not think, oh, maybe this person's a bit too ideological to be a Supreme Court justice? You'd think that, wouldn't you?
I would look at the entirety of their record and I would see what they were responding to. So, for instance, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg made some rather intemperate comments about President Trump before he was elected, I haven't gone and, people questioned whether she'd have to recuse herself from cases involving the administration. I don't question Justice Ginsburg's integrity or her ability to sit as a judge. So, yes, I think you'd have to look at the circumstances under which those comments were made.
Okay, Anisha, Justice Ginsburg's left bent is just the same as Kavanaugh's right bent.
Kavanaugh was not sitting on the Supreme Court when he was making those comments. He was still being interviewed for a job, and I think that is the context we need to be remembering here. This was a job interview, and no one in their right mind goes into a job interview bashing other people, let's say in the firm or in the company, and talks about the fact that they can get along with everyone after that. He was angry. He was shouting. He was cutting off senators, and he was bringing up the Clintons and other right-wing extremist talking points that were not corroborated. And so that is a huge concern. What cases are going to come forward? And when we're talking about his record, if we're going to say we need to look at his entire record, we were looking at that. This is someone who the president chose because he knows he will fulfill his litmus test, whether that's overturning Roe, dismantling the ACA, or whether it's making sure that the president's protected when and if issues with this Russia investigation come forward. These are all things that we have learned based on his record as well. So there was already a lot of concern about Kavanaugh coming into this second hearing and coming into these sexual allegations.
Is it that simple, John, that the president now has a loyal judge on the right who'll push through whatever he wants?
Absolutely not. Judge Kavanaugh, now Justice Kavanaugh, is a fair-minded, independent jurist who has exhibited that time and time again during his dozen years on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, up to and including writing majority opinions in cases ruling against the Bush administration, even though he served at the right hand of President Bush for many of the years that were in question. There was no litmus test. Brett Kavanaugh was on my list of people who I thought would make outstanding Supreme Court justices. I've never asked him his opinion on the Affordable Care Act or about Roe versus Wade or any of the other parade of horribles that you have just heard about. He will, like any good judge, wait for cases to come before him, consider the arguments of counsel, and will rule according to the law.
Anisha Singh, 2 hashtags. Me Too, that's one, right? And November is coming. November is coming
right.
has been used, in many ways, galvanized by everything we've seen now during this battle. Are the midterms going to be as acrimonious as ever? And tell me what this confirmation means for those who feel Kavanaugh should not be a Supreme Court justice. What's going to happen?
I think one of the most beautiful things that has come out of this horrible, horrifying process is that people are galvanized. People are talking about the Supreme Court that have never talked about the Supreme Court before. People who have never really gotten engaged on this issue of the judiciary, who never really understood that process, got up and were learning about the process, busing in, flying into Washington, D.C., going to their senators' offices, getting involved in that process. And so we have a new cohort of people in the communities that care about this issue, who are galvanized and are outraged and want to see change. And I think people are finally starting to understand how important the courts are and how important elections are to those courts, and realizing that senators and the president have that say in who sits in our court. So I think people are realizing that they need to show up and show out and vote this November, because that is the only way to stop this entrenchment of the conservative majority in our courts.
Oh, and that's interesting because, John, I guess you wouldn't begrudge the kind of rejuvenation of democracy, no matter how it comes about. We're seeing something happening in response to this. Anisha's right, isn't she?
Yeah, actually, except for the last little bit of what Anisha said, I agree with everything that she said. She says that people are going to be galvanized to turn out to stop this parade of horribles that she believes the conservatives are foisting upon the country. That part I disagree with. But in terms of everybody being energized and realizing what a horrible process this was and how important the courts are, and realizing that they need to turn out and vote, I agree with all of that. And we'll see how it plays out come November. But certainly people who were thinking about sitting on the sidelines prior to the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings are probably now going to go out and vote. And we'll see where they end up in November.
And the thing that's galvanizing them, just again, John, it's not just someone like Anisha. We even have Senator Elizabeth Warren saying, it hurts every survivor of sexual assault who has been ignored. There are many people, especially many women, who feel aggrieved by this. Is it maybe wise not to just ignore it and say, well, it didn't check out, I'm sorry, you know, Christine Blasey Ford, this wasn't true, and that's the end of that? Or is it worth engaging with what they have to say and what they're upset about?
Oh, look, I would engage with people in the Me Too movement. Let me be clear. I have a son and I have a daughter. And if my daughter came forward and accused somebody of molesting her or sexually assaulting her, I would want that to be thoroughly checked out and her word to be taken seriously. On the other hand, if my son was accused of sexually assaulting somebody, I would also want it to be thoroughly investigated. And if there was not corroboration of that account, I would hope that he would be exonerated and able to get on with his life without this kind of cloud. So yes, Me Too movement needs to be taken seriously. I agree that it is long overdue. On the other hand, people also have a belief in the fairness of process and a presumption of innocence, and have studied all of Judge Kavanaugh's lifelong record and found Dr. Ford's allegations to be wanting in this case. But it has certainly energized people on both sides of the political aisle, and they will turn out in November, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, final word to you, Anisha. We have less than 30 seconds left on this segment.
In order to believe survivors or say that we believe survivors, we need to give survivors the full benefit of doubt and actually listen to the witnesses and listen to all of the evidence that comes forward. That is the exact thing that we had been asking for the entire process. The entire process, it was like pulling teeth to try and get a hearing, to try and get an investigation. Every step of the way, there was trouble and there was a lot that we were up against, and the entire process was a sham. And it's unfortunate, and we can just be hopeful that Judge Kavanaugh is fair and is independent, because lives are at stake. The communities that are trusting the process are at stake. Women are at stake. Healthcare is at stake. Gun rights, everything. You know, this is decades to come. This is a lifetime appointment. So there's a lot at stake here.
Okay, Anisha and John, really enjoyed having you both on the program. Hope you'll come back and join us on the Newsmakers. But for the moment, I have to move on. Thanks again.